perhaps even transnational context, what Mette at some point called the ecology of film schools, where some nations seem to have a richer ecology and others a more sparse ecology and diversity. Okay, so that's one question, the types of institutions and the connection they have to the culture they are in. The core values, of course, discussed in both the presentations as a number of different core values in different types of educations, or a more deep presentation of the core values of the what was it called, the farmhouse project, where we got also a visual feeling of what came out of that kind of approach based on some core values that were certainly anti-corporate and anti-narrative and many other things. The third dimension I mean, that all looked on is impact. And I think we didn't hear a lot about impact in the presentations. Do film schools in fact dominate the world in the sense that the film schools in different contexts are actually deciding what kinds of films are made and what is considered to be the best kind of film practice? Or do we have sort of a mixture of, I think we call them mavericks, that just come from the outside and do different things, and those trained inside the schools? I don't know if you have dealt with that in the project, but that's one thing I would, in a more sort of comparative or maybe empirical sense, but that's what I'm going to ask when we come to discuss it later on. But impact, I think, is something we might discuss. I think we have a feeling in Denmark that the Danish Film School has a really great impact on the kind of filmmaking, although it's not a uniform way of filmmaking. I mean, they certainly have a strong impact on, and filmmakers often say in Denmark that they have had a great experience in the film school in Denmark. So that's maybe an example of a country where the impact is big. I don't know. Okay, but to open the discussion, we have our two other external persons today. Henning Kammer, who has been the principal, as Eva said, of not just the Danish Film School, when it went from the happy days in the 60s to a more professional school later on. Henning had quite a role there. But also the British Film School, National Film School for Television. And I know Henning has also been working in the Middle East with projects developing film education there. So he has a rich sort of background to speak from. And then Jakob Post, who just told me in the break. Yes, okay, Jakob, who just told me that he has been writing a new film law for Bhutan. So that's a new dimension in your life. But other than that, you've been, of course, in Cosmo Doc, you've been a commissioner in documentary film, and now you are CEO of Media Speak. Yes, and I will give the word first to Henning, who can shoot on anything he wants to shoot at or mention or discuss.
Well, where to start? I mean, first of all, I'm impressed by this research, and I look forward to sort of familiarizing completely with it. I actually did a worldwide survey in 1982 of film schools and film education, in particular in the developing world. And what I'm aware, and you're emphasizing that in your research, so much happened in these 30 years. I mean, just to find the institutions that were struggling to set up something in that kind of work was, I mean, succeeded in that. However, I didn't think it made sense to look at that without looking at the production environment. Because why would you have a film school if there were no film production? Or would a film school actually be sort of the adequate way to start production? I mean, that led me later on to various training initiatives and setting up a film school in Zimbabwe before Mugabe went completely mad, and in Ghana and some other places. And so what I can say, yeah, I mean, there are many ways, and there is not one that fits everybody. And that the same is true for the so-called more established schools. I worked with Select for more than 20 years, and even though the Select schools are considered sort of the established schools, they're not equally good. No, because I think in my time we were looking, trying to look at a certain level, quality level, and I think now they have opened up the gates and have a much bigger membership. That's a good way of doing it, but it's no guarantee, certainly not. I think if I look at the types of schools, first of all, I think the majority of the university-based schools, I mean, they mainly train what they call filmmakers. What's a filmmaker? A filmmaker is a film director in that world, because that's what everybody wants to be. And those who cannot make it, I mean, they can only sort of do the camera or something. And of course, if we look at the huge number of students, not least in the US, I mean, why are there thousands of students? That's because they need the income in order to pay for the tenure staff, so that they can actually have a proper graduate program, postgraduate program. And the others, I mean, they fall by, majority typically fall by the wayside. You've probably all heard of brilliant people who come from NYU or USC or UCLA, but in particular NYU, if you look at the numbers, it's almost impossible that there wouldn't be a genius every now and then. So, I mean, that's the one type of school which you also find in Britain. When I was director of the National Film and Television School, I met with we had sort of a kind of a British sort of gathering of schools every now and then, and I realized we had almost nothing in common, except that we were doing something with film. But the dominant type of school in Europe is sort of the conservatory style school. And the characteristics of that is that it has much smaller intake. It's very often publicly financed, so it can afford not to depend on the numbers. And more and more of the schools will now have specialized training in the key fields that constitute what you need in order to produce a film. But I think that what we are generally, I think it's still the case, are struggling with in many schools, is that there is no real tradition for film education, for film training. I mean, if you set up a new law faculty or medicine. I mean, there are hundreds of experiences, and there's lots of, I mean, how you do it and how you don't do it. That doesn't really exist when it comes to film. And that's also why so much of the training is practice-based. It's not that I'm against practice, but if it's only practice, I don't think it will lead anywhere. Because I mean, what most schools, I mean, except for the period where the East European schools and the Soviet schools, I mean, because Lenin had coined that film to be sort of the most important way to reach masses, to get propaganda through. All these countries established schools and had the resources to actually start sort of what constitutes sort of a proper curriculum and experience, and part of that is sort of still valid. In our part of the world, Western Europe, this has not been the case, and therefore most of the schools will use practitioners, professional film people to teach, and that is brilliant if they can teach, but many of them can't, and that leads sort of a curriculum to sort of, in best cases, I mean, it in a meaningful way, but it can also develop into something which is just repeat what we used to do, and this is sort of, they did not say it's for the production mill, but it could easily for the production. There's no new development of new ideas and new approaches, and I think that's one of the key problems that the majority of the school will be struggling with. And of course, I would want to hear how much have you been able to dig into this problem in your research?
Well, I'm responsible for one chapter myself, but I'm responsible for one chapter myself. In terms of the team, I mean, each particular chapter deals with a specific case. So I would say, for example, the chapter on Cuba, I actually think looks quite closely at a number of these issues that you're raising, because it really is a matter of looking carefully at the way in which the curriculum has been adjusted in response to political changes, global pressures, and so forth. So there is quite a careful analysis of the curricular structure. And I think also the one focusing on the Anglophone Caribbean, where it's basically a matter of more or less starting from scratch. So I mean, that's in the context of the university environment. So the discussion, the curricular discussion, is again very, very explicit, and explicit in relation to a set of very specific challenges as well. So I do think that definitely that aspect of the project is there. In some cases, for example, the Australian chapter, it's a little bit more superficial probably, because there's an evocation of the larger ecology, and so there's not as much of a focus on the specific curricular structure of the different institutions. As far as my own contribution is concerned, as I said, I was focusing very much on this Middle East project, which I saw as very much articulating the values of the Danish Film School, and the philosophy and the commitment to art, and also with regard to the question of impact. I felt that it was actually, I sent out questionnaires to most of the filmmakers who had been involved in this particular project, and certainly trying to get a sense of what the impact exactly had been. And one of the things that I was very interested in trying to understand was whether there was a differential in terms of the impact of this kind of setup with regard to the students who were being sent from the National Film School here in Denmark, as compared to the impact of the setup on the students who were coming from the Middle East to Denmark. So I suppose that would lead with regard to questions like affordances, so what does this particular setup actually afford in the way of, action tendencies and behaviour, and then also this question of impact. And one of the things I paid a lot of attention to, and I think that this emerged from the project as a whole as well, I find that the curricula are described in such dramatically different ways. If you look at the wonderful thing that I wanted to talk about before is the language that is used to describe this particular project is absolutely beautiful. And it's, may I read just one? Yeah. Okay, so here's one rule, right? So it's about an equal encounter with another artist. The thought animating this project is that of a meeting as equals. An artist from here meets an artist from there. It can be put that simply. An encounter. Methods, material, and language are exchanged. One works together, one spends time together, plans activities together. There are encounters over a cup of coffee or a meal. There is work on equal terms. The equality arises from the wish really to encounter the other in the exchange of ideas and language. Now, I could go on, I have all of these lovely citations, but if you compare that kind of use of language to, for example, what is going on in the case of the Anglophone Caribbean in the context of a university where it's a much more sort of bureaucratic description of how the curriculum is going to be designed and so on. So that was one thing that I was quite intrigued by, that somehow, and I suppose I am a great believer in the idea that setting the tone and choosing one's terms carefully is really, really important. It's important if one is involved in institution building of any sort, and that includes universities and I assume also film schools. So there's a clear contrast between a sort of a kind of a very light, almost poetic, but very powerful use of language as compared to a much more sort of, one could even say almost paranoid kind of use of language, because one is so busy sort of keeping in mind the bureaucratic exigencies and the funding parameters and so on and so forth, so it becomes very, very heavy.
I think we should bring in Jakob now, so we can always go back to him again.
I want to congratulate on I received a PDF of the books. I haven't read them at all, but just glanced through it, and I think it's a major contribution that you're looking at that whole spectrum of activities that are not just film school and are not film production per se, but all those initiatives, all that's in between, that sometimes become pure practice, as you say, sometimes has some kind of training, often with some project impetus in it, and I think it's important that, as Henning is saying, maybe the film education doesn't stand that clearly. It's not a firm ground of universal standards, and the industry is quite strong in film, so we have to look at what's happening in a much broader field. And in that regard, I think, the chapters deal with single cases, but one thing that I would like to explore or ask about is the kinds of institutions that are now involved, whereas it may have been earlier mainly conservatories style European or US universities. If we look at the kinds of institutional interests that you have in education, film training, it's festivals, as is mentioned in one of the chapters very interestingly, but it's also production companies. Ridley Scott Associates is highly involved in talent development these days. It's regional authorities with a completely different look. It's brands, Puma, Gucci, others are into film talent development. It's development agencies, media NGOs. It's charity foundations. I'm chairman of an organization called STEPS, where we get massive amounts of money from Soros, Gates, Ford Foundation, for something that for them is not about film training, but the money is actually spent on film training. So how does that change the picture? And academic work as well. Actually, right now it's increasing. We have increasingly numbers of films being produced with as academic research. The Act of Killing is an excellent example of that. So we have all these kinds of interests in the field, and how does one look at it? I mean, I could have the kind of puritanical look that would be how many of these interests are actually closely related to what's good for talent or for the film training. And especially, and I think that's I mean, you have a global perspective here, but sometimes we tend to forget the divides. I think every nation on earth would want to have a film school if they could afford one. And I think all the nations that do have national film schools have a stronger outset, no matter, and then all the other activities can create a richer film ecology. And I especially see a problem in countries where filmmakers have no access to anything that's purely talent development or purely film training. I think that's a huge problem. In those cases, because in Denmark you can choose, you can pick and choose, and you can step from one place to another, and you get your own film school even outside film school. And in that particular perspective, I really think that twinning programs are a problem. They also have a very strong ideological input. It's the discourse at the moment. It's the one thing you can get money to from development agencies and others, the idea of twinning, but that's not, for me at least, it's not a pure idea of film training. It's a particular value-based method that doesn't, at least seen from an industry perspective, hasn't shown its worth yet.
Can I just ask, does everybody know what twinning is? Or should we maybe just,
the idea that you have one filmmaker from this part of the world and one from well, it could be, it doesn't necessarily have to be that kind of twinning, but that's often the case, that underprivileged and privileged filmmakers are put together to develop projects together. So I think in that sense, I mean, the chapter seems to have very good empirical studies, but somehow if you could take the next level of comparison, of institutional interests, and I think it would all come together. Very interesting conclusions may come up.
Okay. Scott, can I ask you about the impact of the Farming House project you were talking about on the Canadian film production? I think you almost said that there was no production because the big brother down south, called America, takes up a lot of it. But I mean, watching all those films, I was reminded of very early sort of avant-garde, associative, visual kind of filmmaking, barefoot filmmaking almost, but with a sort of, yeah. But you explained why it came about. It was a kind of other way of doing things than the normal mainstream. But what's the impact of this school, do you think?
Well, I guess it depends how you describe impact. To use like a local example of something like Dogma 95, the rhetoric that's generated about reimagining what the cinema ought to be is more important in the end than whether or not the rules are followed correctly. In the similar function, or fashion rather, in rethinking and reimagining how filmmaking and film practice is taught, one rethinks the possibility of films. It doesn't mean, and it won't be the case, that any of these films ever play at the local Cineplex. But part of the rationale behind the project is to argue that that doesn't have to be the only goal or sole goal of filmmaking. So its impact then is for both a new generation of filmmakers who are in school, and for more seasoned filmmakers like John Grayson, who's working SOP there, to rethink their own practices, and therefore rethink the types of images they'll put in circulation and the types of questions that their films can bring about. When Meta was reading that rule earlier from her project, I'm struck by the fact that one of the things that it's really talking about is not an instrumental account of what type of film has to come out of it, but it's essentially a rule about the relationship between two people. Right? And so film and other types of creative work can become a means by which discussions that have nothing to do with the nature, or don't solely have to do with the nature of the image on the screen, can come about. It can be a catalyst for other things. And I think that's one of the other impacts of not just projects like Film Farm, but other alternative modes of film practice methodology and film practice-based education.
Okay, we are going to continue the discussion a little while up here, but I think we should open up for the floor. So if you have any questions, I think Eva can keep track of it. But Jakob, you wanted to...
I just have a quick question. Is it less film education and more re-education, or I don't know what you call it? But
The re-education of the filmmaker. Yes.
Because the people who come are all basically trained in film to some extent, so it's more kind of reconfiguring or de-learning, or I don't know what to call it.
It's like if you go to a creative writing school, which Canada, that's not very big, it's huge in Britain, and everyone's taught to write like Hemingway, and then suddenly you go to a place where you're taught to write like Joyce, right? It's but I like the notion of the re-education of the filmmaker. I mean, that should have been titled. But it is precisely about that. It's about thinking outside the paradigms that you've either already been taught, either through school or through the industry, as the only or sole means by which to use moving images.
Do you have examples of these people later on producing interesting films different from what they did before?
No. Yes. Yeah. No. I'd go back to John Grayson's example, who's a fairly famous Canadian queer filmmaker who's incorporated some of the process-based and collaborative aspects of what he came across in film from after being a filmmaker for 25 years into the way in which he's made his subsequent activist films, especially the ones about sort of the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement against this on behalf of Palestine. And he's used those collaborative processes, both in terms of moving away from model filmmaking where he wants to get things in the movie screens, but also collaborative processes to make new works that are then distributed through Vimeo, YouTube, and what have you. And once it gives away the notion that he's going to make money from this, a certain type of creativity is allowed that would be precluded perhaps before.
So it's kind of brain-changing chamber.
Yes, it's a diuretic for filmmakers.
now we're at the sort of impact question, which is of course a difficult question. But if I could ask Henning, Jakob, and Mette to reflect on. I think Jakob said that he thought that those countries where they had a national film school, that could be the basis, and then from that on they could develop a bigger and more rich structure, were the best cultures in the sense of what worked, so to speak. But does that also mean that they have a very big impact in those countries that we're talking about, so that practically nothing really happens outside the school and those affiliates and other things that are attached to it or are connected to it, or what? I mean, have you done any sort of study of different types and how strong the impact is, or is it just embedded in the single chapters you haven't summarized?
We haven't summarized it. We haven't. I mean, if you take, for example, the chapter on Lithuania, right, where the BGIK is a very, very important, plays a very, very important role, but also because of the sort of small nation dynamics there, what you get basically is a very kind of productive resistance to that. So that actually is a very interesting example of being dependent on a particular institution, and that dependency then spawning a whole set of sort of alternative practices and these sort of so-called anti-institutionalist practices, which have, of course, a kind of a vulnerability, and they're temporary, and they're just not as robust. And then compared to perhaps an example would be the Lotz Film School, right, which nobody has focused on. I think that this is one of the ones that Duncan has got on his agenda, which ends up, of course, being very, very important in Poland, but also ends up being a very important source of inspiration outside of Poland. So one of the things that we noticed when we all got together in Hong Kong was that Jyoti Tukits, who was a key figure at the Lodz School, suddenly, you know, he's actually part of the initiative in Scotland, and you know, it was his being at the Edinburgh Film Festival and sort of sharing with the audience that actually sort of planted the seed of having a Scottish film school. And then, you know, the people from Australia said, oh, but wait a minute, he ended up in Australia. He played an absolutely crucial role in terms of the, you know, the film school in Sydney as well. So I think that, yes, these some institutions, I mean, there's no way we're going to be able to say there's one impact. I mean, and I think that that is the strength of the case-based approach, is that we do get some fairly thick descriptions and fine-grained accounts, which hopefully will be suggestive for people who are working with these issues, and then, you know, it will be for others to take, you know, this forward, and of course we'll do our best too. But we haven't tried to sort of come up with a definitive narrative about this. And coming back to, if I may just very briefly, Jakob's point also about twinning, for example, even there you would need a sort of a more fine-grained account as well, because there's so many different models of twinning as well, right? So, yeah.
Good.
No, it's just, you mentioned the Australian Film School, and interprets the previous director of the school in Woods, when he came to Australia, he didn't set up the copy of the Woods school.
No.
And why did he not do that? Because it's a different culture.
Yes, exactly.
And he would have been wrong just to make sort of a copy of what he did already.
Yeah.
So it's just sort of proving the thing that there's not sort of the formula which is right.
No, exactly.
Well, you have been the principal of two schools, one in Denmark and the one in England. Could you tell us something about was it the same kind of strategy, core values you wanted to develop, or was it different cultures? You talked a little about it, that the English one was quite different from the Danish, but
Well,
what
no,
did you want to achieve?
My strategy for the Danish school was that to create a whole new generation who could take over and wipe out some of the old guard. and we did succeed eventually. But that required that we would train what I call the key specializations. And to a large extent give them the same kind of training, plus of course what they needed in their specialization. But they needed a core of theoretical and analytic knowledge that would make it possible for them to communicate properly. And for everybody in that crew to contribute to the end result. Not all of them sort of wanted to do different things or only stick to their specialization, but actually from the knowledge they could have in camera or editing or sound to contribute to the vision of the writer and the director. And I think that I mean, of course you cannot say that would work in all cases, but that was the philosophy. When I came to Britain, where there's a much bigger tradition for filmmaking and a long tradition for writing, which we didn't have in Denmark. We set it up, it didn't exist before. In the 80s, nobody in Denmark would say, I'm a screenwriter. It's unthinkable. It's only when we established the writing program and gave it status that people said, I don't know. But
Go to admit it's public, that's
it's just sort of a movement for something else. I mean, come on, you didn't want to do that. But in Britain, first of all, I thought that this is going to be easy. Because they've got everybody. They've got all the great people in all the different fields. But that's not the people I saw when I came to the school. And because I was used to, in Denmark, I was used to bring in people from outside and they would have to come. And so I thought the same would be the case in Britain. Not at all. The next thing was that considering the fact that the British film industry and American film industry is sort of very interrelated and very much sort of based on sort of producing, it could be good or bad, but it's industrialized. It's not that much industry anymore, but that's what's behind it. And so it surprised me that I ended up sort of at a school with sort of an auteur culture, which was sort of completely contradictory to what was actually being produced. And you know, I'm not against auteurs, it's just so rare that I meet them. So it made absolutely no sense. And when I introduced, of course I didn't make a replica of the Danish school, but of course there were some ideas, like they need this sort of common basis sort of for working and for going on. And I remember really when I introduced this, and they were all the various student groups were there, and one guy stood up, student, and said, do you actually mean that everybody sort of should participate? I mean, also the sound guys. And I said, yes, also the sound guys. And but that was sort of showing, I mean, that kind of culture, because they were not being seen as creative members of a group that were necessary to create the best possible result. They're just hands. And I think that was true for a lot of the others too. So that's a different attitude, and you find that every and of course in the US, even though it's not at all in the tradition of American filmmaking, because they have filmmaker programs, they will not be directors.
We have someone who would like to ask a question. I know she's Catty trained. So Heidi has a question, and afterwards you have us just to also open the audience.
Yeah, but that was just okay.
Yeah.
It was just Scott. It was very interesting to this about the film farm, and I would like to ask you which kind of feedback they get there, because some of the research that I've been involved in points out that somehow some of the filmmakers really like the idea of having feedback as support. Not instead of money, but as like together with money. It's very, very important to them that they actually get some kind of mentoring feedback, inspiration. So which kind of feedback do they have there?
Well, not money. But yeah, I mean, like, the process itself is based around, or the philosophy behind it is based around continually talking about your work throughout the week. As you're learning different skills, tinting, coding, scratching, editing, what have you. And then at the end of week, 8 days, whatever, screening, everyone's work is discussed and commented on, both in terms of what they've tried to achieve, what they'd like to do with it next, and in types of responses the other filmmakers, the workers there, the filmmakers there, and myself, and Janine, the writers there, because we run a writing workshop at the same time. It's based on the same principles. Give feedback on the work. And so all the work through all its different steps is discussed based on the attitude both for filmmaking and for the writing side of things. Then still presenting people with a finished product and then getting feedback and you know, adjusting your final cut. That discussion of your process is going on throughout the creative process itself. And yeah, I think it's successful, but then of course I'm going to say that it's a failure, it's awful, I can't believe we do it. But no, I mean, I think it offers a very different way of giving feedback than what happens in, because I've taught on production, I've taught production-based programs, and feedback comes at the end on whether you succeeded or failed at your goals, and it's all part of the creative process itself. And feedback is often looked upon as something that, you know, some, especially the ones who want to be auteurs, show a lot of resistance to, because man, you're trampling on my vision, right? So when it's part of the process, I think it leads to a different type of creative and discursive dynamic of the work. Or at least I hope so.
Yeah, it seems to be an alternative to this. Pia Ambo said that I had to go to school called A, B, and C, and I wanted to make something different. So in terms of being creative and having good processes, it seems really, really like a good way, interesting way to do it.
Okay. You have all presented a very, at least Meta and Scott have presented a very critical view of these university-based American programs. But are there any positive aspects of them that can be like that can be shed a light on, or is it merely just like an extension of a sort of failing American college system that's just more or less designed to put people in debt, or are there any positive aspects to this?
I'm an optimist.
Yeah, I'd like to raise a positive flag because I think if there's a lack of innovation sometimes in film schools, reproducing what the industry is demanding and thereby killing their own if you look at the most interesting experimental work, it happens at US universities. It's the Labyrinth program at USC, Media Lab, MIT, Sensory Ethnography Lab at Harvard. So I do think they have nucleuses, or whatever they're called, of something really radical and interesting. But the interesting part is that many of them are not the film school departments, but transdisciplinary. In Harvard, it's a study that's both involved with architecture, ecology, and anthropology, and filmmaking. Okay. And then they have Dusan Makabiev and the likes to teach. So it's not sort of the average film program, but I think we should bash US because there's no.
But because of the philosophy of the transdisciplinary programs they're in, and people teaching there have a different set of ideas for goals and outcomes than perhaps more traditional-based film schools.
I can just share with you Hermine Nafisi's response to Toby Miller's intervention.
Excuse me?
I can just share with you Hermine Nafisi's response to Toby Miller's intervention, which was that very, very critical intervention that he made, because Hermine is himself a graduate of USC. Yes. And he said it's too one-sided. Look at what I have been able to do with the training that I've got. And of course he got that a while back, and I do think that Toby is focusing on more recent trends, and I do think that the different arguments that he put forward are probably sound, but they probably are not the whole picture. So it's, I don't think that the intent was ever to sort of crash the US scene entirely, not at all, but simply we had, building on earlier work, we simply wanted to have, as I said, a kind of a small nation-centric approach to this, because we didn't cover everything, but at the same time we needed some sort of intervention there. And I think actually in terms of the US discussion, what's probably most interesting is the discussion of the transplantation of programs and the branch campus initiatives and so on and so forth, in my own view. Okay. So like and that is actually, I mean, on the one hand, I mean, it's also so nuanced, right? Because on the one hand, people are right to say that there is something dodgy about the funding setup and that there's something neo-colonial about the model and so on and so forth. But if you look at why someone like Hermine Nafisi got involved in this whole initiative in Qatar, it was because, he remembers his sisters not being able to get an education. Here suddenly was this opportunity to build an institution that was all about allowing Qatari women to get an education, right? So and I think that's why the thick descriptions are helpful, because they force us to see that quick judgments are probably not actually that accurate.
Thank you. That was very exhaustive.
Famous last question.
One thing that has always struck me about the Danish National Film School is this uneasy tension between training of filmmakers and directors, which proffers or to succeed as a film director, you have to be able to push your ideas, you have to, at least when they talk about their film training, also they talk about finding a voice at the film school. Whereas for the other personnel groups that you talk about, there tends to be more of an old-fashioned craft training, and supposedly they have a much more ease in going into the industry and working with television if you're a cinematographer, editor, or sound person. Doesn't that, whereas one sort of maybe invites a kind of self-expression, authorship-based training, whereas the other craft training for a certain technical position for 4 years seems to be requiring something completely different. Isn't that a kind of tension? Is that a tension that you've seen at other film schools also? Or? Yes.
I don't think so. No, I mean, I've seen many examples of schools that have exactly that division between. I mean, very much like the National Film School when I came, but it's not what I see in Denmark. And what it's taken years, because this is not. This was only mainly the teachers, getting teachers sort of turned around, or the teachers, I mean the professionals turned around, thinking in a different way, and of course, I mean a lot of teaching was involving all groups, and that was I think the essential thing that we gave them sort of a joint language by which they could communicate creative ideas. I'm not saying it works all the time, and of course there may be students who turn out sort of to be mainly sort of focusing on their craft, but it's certainly not the idea.
Okay. I think there is a tension, but it's a good tension in most cases, because they do think somewhat differently, but that's part of productive tension, as I see.
Okay, I think we have.
We have a last question.
Okay, I think famous last question.
It's actually just following on what Johannes said, because I think that maybe you can talk about another issue here, that maybe everyone is taught that the Danish film school to be not only crafts people but also storytellers and artists in a more traditional sense, you could say. But we can talk about a problem of definitions in terms of the study that you have been working on with, and I wanted to ask you about that, because there was just the fact that there are so many different approaches as to how to be a filmmaker. I attended a film direction course in India in 2006 and 2007, and compared to how it is being taught film direction in Copenhagen, it's a really different experience. And talking about, I went to ECTV in Cuba as well, and talked to them, and just you get a cultural shock beyond the nation that you're in. So I just want to hear your thoughts about how it's difficult to compare all the different institutions.
Well, again, I have two things to share with you in that regard. The one, again, back to the Middle East project, for the people who were coming from the Middle East, they kept saying this was so liberating. It was this whole idea of sort of positive freedom, because they were encountering a pedagogy unlike anything they had ever encountered before. And I have so many examples of people going on and on and on about what the Danish pedagogy meant to them, and this being something that they would carry with them, and you've got people like Corinne Shawi, who is well known to people here, who is now sort of practicing that pedagogy. And then another example of the sort of the differences of pedagogy and how complicated things can very quickly become again because of that, the Dan Faso project, where Denmark is involved in training people in Burkina Faso, where there's been a lot of conflict. I saw the conflict there when I was, at Imagine, and then yesterday I met with Tina Sørensen at the film school to try to understand how she saw that particular conflict, and she presented, it was wonderful. She had this perfect analysis of the conflict as being traceable to completely different pedagogical approaches. So whereas the Danish photographer students who were sent down there to train felt that they should be using a learning by doing approach, so you give people their assignments and then maybe you sort of sit around for a while having thought the assignments through very carefully, and you drink some coffee and it doesn't look like you're working. From the Burkinabe perspective, this was the most lazy form of training that anybody could ever do, right? And you end up with huge fights, and it becomes very, very complicated. So, differences of pedagogy are crucial. And in terms of the Indian context, the Indian intellectuals that I've spoken to, people associated with the Sarai, for example, in Delhi, were saying in response to this sort of project, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could actually try to sort of capture the specificity of a kind of Indian pedagogy that we would really like to see practice, which could go right down to something like, is there, for example, an Indian approach that we would like to see captured in terms of editing and framing and so on and so forth. So I think differences of pedagogy are absolutely crucial, and I don't think we quite knew that when we started the project, but that's certainly one of the things that has emerged and is massively on the radar at this point, I think.
Okay, I think we should thank the panel.